It was 10:43 p.m. on February 2nd, 2021 when the call came. Through trembling sobs and choking breaths, the voice on the line begged for help. She shot herself. She's in the bathtub. She's dead. Within minutes, sirens rushed to the modest home in Athol, Idaho. On arrival, first responders confronted a harrowing scene. A naked woman, motionless, lying in a water-filled bathtub, her head bearing a gunshot wound. Submerged beside her lay a pistol, murky with bathwater. The man on the threshold, a former state trooper named Dan Howard, wailed and begged for answers. He claimed he had found his wife, Kendy Howard, upstairs, and that she had taken her own life. But from the first moments, investigators felt the scene didn't quite align with a simple suicide. An overworked dryer still running, a packed duffel bag at the bottom of the stairs, fresh deodorant stains on Dan's shirt. These would become puzzle pieces in a chilling, twisted case. This is the story of how Dan Howard's 911 call unraveled into a deadly web of suspicion, forensic scrutiny, courtroom battle, and ultimate conviction. Dan and Kendy Howard had been married about 26 years. To many, they appeared accomplished and stable. Dan was formerly an Idaho state trooper. Their home in rural Athol sat on a parcel of land, and they had built significant assets over decades. But beneath that image lay strains and grievances. According to those close to them, money became a recurrent fault line. Kendy, a medical service worker, had grown restless about financial control and independence. Friends say she became more vocal about wanting change. In the months before her death, Kendy told friends she was thinking of divorce and had even begun meeting with attorneys. Her daughter, Brooke Wilkins, later testified Kendy had told her she was unhappy in the marriage and that the balance of power had shifted. Their relationship had other dark episodes. In 2013, while Dan was still a trooper, Kendy had an affair with a neighbor who was also a friend of Dan's. Dan confronted the man at his workplace, reportedly threatening violence and later pleading guilty to some harassment charges and resigning. After that, friends say, things changed between Dan and Kendy. She became more dissatisfied and he more controlling. A few days before her death, Kendy's mother requested a welfare check after Kendy made a panic call. Deputies responded. In body cam footage, Kendy told them she'd asked Dan for a divorce. She said he wasn't taking it well. She described waking to him standing over her, wearing dark clothes and gloves, holding a pillow, saying she feared for her life. But she never clearly said he had struck her, so no arrest was made. Later, she returned home. When Dan returned from a long out-of-state job that evening, Kendy met him at the door. She reportedly gave him preliminary divorce papers. An argument ensued. Their last hours together would become the most scrutinized in their lives. Dan Howard says he was downstairs when he heard a thump from upstairs. He claimed he went up later after more than an hour and discovered Kendy in the bathtub. He immediately dialed 911. On the call, he wept and stuttered, "My wife, she shot herself. She's in the bathtub. She's dead." When deputies arrived, they found Dan pacing, screaming, gagging, begging for help. Yet, as Deputy Miranda Thomas later recounted, no tears ever fell. His behavior struck some as performative. In the bathroom, Kendy lay naked in the tub. Her gun was submerged in the water at the bottom. The wound to her head appeared severe. The scene was dispatched as a likely suicide. Yet investigators immediately sensed dissonance. Detective Jerry Northrup noted that for a woman to take her own life nude in a bathtub is unusual, not impossible, he cautioned, but atypical. What caught Northrup's attention most was blood volume. Despite a fatal head wound, there was not the expected saturation of blood in the water, on her body or around the tub. Deputy Thomas, too, noticed puzzles. In the laundry room, a dryer was running, filled with bath towels and mats. The display showed 6 minutes remaining. When Northrup checked the appliance specs, he determined that the cycle must have begun around 10:42 p.m., just 1 minute before Dan's 911 call at 10:43 p.m. Why would someone start laundry at that hour, especially in a crisis? Also staged as odd, a duffel bag packed with women's clothes sat at the foot of the stairs. Did someone intend to flee? Broken shards of glass littered the primary bedroom floor. A struggle perhaps occurred. Behind the bathroom door, damp towels. Kendy's clothes were strewn. Dan, meanwhile, appeared to have recently showered. His clothing was clean, and fresh deodorant marks showed on his shirt. When asked about gunshot residue, GSR, Dan's responses were jittery. He repeatedly shoved his hands into his pockets, twisting and turning them as if trying to wipe something. The test came back negative. In a chilling moment, Dan phoned Brooke, his stepdaughter, to deliver the news. Over that call, Brooke accused him, "You did this." That accusation, heard by investigators, became a psychological turning point. By dawn, the autopsy and forensic review teams had begun their deep dive. The original medical examiner ruled death by the gunshot to the head. But from the start, defense and prosecution would disagree sharply over what actually killed Kendy. Enter Dr. Jennifer Nara, a pathologist brought in by prosecutors. In her review, she found the bullet trajectory odd. It entered from the back of the mouth, traveling slightly downward through the tongue, not the usual self-inflicted pattern. She argued that if the heart were still beating, the blood flow should have been magnitude greater in the water. She saw too little blood for that shot to have occurred while alive. Moreover, Kendy's body bore multiple bruises and lacerations, and her jaw was fractured. Some of the bruises were on both sides of her neck, consistent with strangulation or choking. Nara concluded that Kendy may have already been dead when she was shot. Prosecutors built a theory that Dan Howard used a carotid restraint, hold a pressure technique he knew from his law enforcement training to incapacitate or kill Kendy by cutting off blood flow to the brain. Once she was dead or incapacitated, he placed her in the bathtub and fired a shot to simulate suicide. The defense, however, stuck to the original autopsy's conclusion. They argued Kendy's death was suicide and emphasized that Dan's DNA was excluded from her gun, that is, no prints or DNA. They pointed to timing discrepancies, water drainage, delayed photographs, to explain the minimal blood presence. Detectives and prosecutors watched Dan's interviews closely. His narrative shifted subtly over repeated retellings. The timeline he presented, waiting, hearing a thud, going upstairs later, contradicted the tight timing of the dryer cycle and the 911 call. Former Detective Sergeant Ken Lalaton, who would later lead questioning, later said, "Dan knows things that most normal people, ordinary people, don't know, things like killing someone and staging it to look like a suicide." Late that night, prosecutors confronted Dan with the overheard conversation from Brooke's call. In body cam footage, Sergeant Lalaton asked directly, "You did it, didn't you, Dan?" Dan responded, "No, I didn't. She wasn't here." But by then, the investigators believed they were past suspicion. They were building a case. The question became, could they tie all the pieces together in court? The first 48 hours passed with investigators racing against time. The scene at the Howard home yielded oddities, but not definitive arrest evidence. What followed was a slow, meticulous piecing together of motive, behavior, and forensic reinterpretation until, more than 2 years later, Dan Howard would finally be charged. From the moment deputies cleared the house, they knew the apparent suicide narrative would not stand unchallenged. Detectives shook hands and whispered, "We're going back in." Dan Howard's conduct in those early interviews already bore the marks of someone used to wielding authority, calm, collected, rehearsed. Detective Sergeant Ken Lalaton, later a lead in the case, said he sensed something scripted in Dan's version of events. The timing, the narrative, even the emotional display. In body cam footage, Lalaton challenges Dan. "You did it, didn't you, Dan?" He recounts. Dan's posture recoiled, voice faltered as if the net was closing. In early strategy sessions, prosecutors and forensic experts debated alternative causes of death. The original medical examiner's ruling that the fatal gunshot was the primary cause was challenged fiercely in court filings. Dr. Jennifer Nara, a contract pathologist, submitted a report stating that the bullet's trajectory from back of tongue to downward and the lack of saturated bleeding in the tub were inconsistent with a gunshot delivered to a conscious, breathing person. She argued that Kendy Howard exhibited signs of pre-mortem trauma bruises, neck markings, fractured jaw, pointing instead to asphyxiation or a choking technique. Prosecutors settled on a theory. Dan, using knowledge from his law enforcement training, applied a carotid restraint hold, cutting blood flow to the brain, or a similar method to debilitate or kill Kendy. Once incapacitated or dead, he placed her in the tub and shot her to simulate suicide. But that theory alone wouldn't carry a case. They needed more. They collected interviews from friends and acquaintances. Kendy had confided in them about marital strife, financial control, and threats. One friend testified that weeks before her death, Kendy showed clear bruising she attributed to Dan. In April 2023, more than 2 years after the bathtub discovery, authorities felt they had amassed enough probable cause. Dan Howard was formally indicted in Kootenai County for first-degree murder and domestic battery, the latter stemming from an earlier 2020 incident in which Kendy had bruises on her ear, chest, and arm, under Idaho law. When charges were filed, Dan Howard surrendered, but events soon veered into the dramatic. During his trial proceedings, Dan, out on bail on strict conditions, violated terms by being near the Spokane International Airport. He claimed he was there to help a friend return a rental car, but investigators believed he may have been planning to flee. On a subsequent day in December 2023, as the trial loomed, officers arrested him at the airport for bond violation, marking an almost cinematic reversal. The ex-trooper, once seen as untouchable, handcuffed in public. The prosecution didn't try to use the airport incident directly in the murder trial. It might have risked prejudicing the jury. But the violation led to revocation of bail and confinement in the Kootenai County Jail as the case moved forward. In the weeks before trial, both sides squared off in motions, expert disclosures, and fierce pretrial battles. The defense pressed to exclude or discredit the NARA report and other expert testimony. They leaned heavily on the original medical examiner, Dr. John Howard, no relation, who testified he saw no compelling evidence beyond the gunshot that Kendy died from anything but a self-inflicted wound. Yet in cross-examination, probing questions revealed that Dr. John Howard had not reviewed supplemental expert reports, had not photographed bruises, and had limited familiarity with the scene photos or all pathology findings. In opposition, the state presented testimony from forensic specialists, including a strangulation expert and blood loss analyst, who asserted that the absence of expected blood volume was consistent with the victim being dead at time of the shot, and that the bruising pattern was highly suspicious. The defense also highlighted that Dan's DNA was excluded from Kendy's gun, that is, no prints or DNA linked him, and that no definitive weapon handling evidence tied him to the shooting. They argued the discrepancies in blood volume could be explained by drainage delay, evaporation, or other environmental factors. Despite these tensions, the state obtained permission to present the complex theories of asphyxiation, staging, and behavior analysis to the jury. The stage was set for a trial loaded with technical testimony, emotional intensity, and the question, could they persuade a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? The trial of Dan Howard opened on March 4, 2024, in Kootenai County, Idaho. Over the course of about 10 days, the courtroom became a battleground of expert testimony, emotional family statements, and dueling narratives, all under the question, did Dan murder his wife, or did she take her own life? Prosecution, Stan Mortensen et al., laid out their thesis from the start. Kendy's death was no suicide. Their opening described a night of fury, a marital fight over finances and control, leading to Dan choking or strangling Kendy using a carotid restraint technique, and then staging the scene, placing her naked in the bathtub, pulling her hair back, positioning the gun, and shooting her post-mortem to fabricate a self-inflicted gunshot wound. They argued that the blood evidence, bruising, trajectory, and Dan's behavior would prove the falsification. Defense, Jason Johnson, countered that the scene was consistent with suicide. He emphasized that Dan's DNA was excluded from Kendy's gun, no fingerprints or prints linked him to operating it, and that the original medical examiner, Dr. John Howard, had concluded the gunshot was the cause of death. Johnson suggested that the lack of blood could be attributed to delays, drainage, or the way the crime scene was documented and pressed, that shifting narratives are normal under stress. The duel was set. Each side would call experts and witnesses to support their version of what happened that February night. Dr. Nara, brought in by the prosecution, walked the jury through the autopsy photos, radiographs, and pathology reports. She highlighted the bullet path entering behind the tongue, traveling downward a trajectory that, in her view, was inconsistent with self-infliction. The absence of copious bleeding in the bathtub and on her body, which she argued should have been more pronounced, had the gunshot occurred while the heart was pumping strongly. Multiple bruises, abrasions, and a broken jaw, including bruising on both sides of her neck, potentially indicating manual strangulation or chokehold force before death. Her conclusion: Kendy may have been already incapacitated or dead when the gunshot occurred. Defense attorneys probed her methodology. They asked whether delay in photographing or water dilution could explain less apparent blood, and whether some bruises might have been caused during the stage of moving or positioning. The original examiner, Dr. John Howard, no relation, testified for the defense. He reaffirmed his earlier ruling that the fatal gunshot to the head was the cause of death. He disputed the assertion that the blood evidence was incompatible, suggesting that over time, water and drainage could reduce visible signs. Cross-examination hammered at whether he had reviewed all evidence, for example, supplemental photos, alternate expert reports, and whether he had considered all possibilities of premortem trauma. Defense counsel used the absence of definitive proof of strangulation to bolster the suicide argument. Brooke Wilkins, Kendy's daughter, delivered powerful testimony. She told the court that her mother had spoken to her about the marriage's strain, and that just days before her death, Kendy asked Brooke if she would attend her funeral, a chilling, fatal foreshadowing. During the 911 aftermath, Brooke and Dan exchanged a phone call in which she accused him of killing her mother. That moment was later described by detectives as pivotal in cracking Dan's composure. Friends and neighbors testified about the dynamics in the couple's relationship. Bouts of control, financial conflict, Dan's perceived jealousy, and Kendy's frustration and fear. Some recounted incidents of bruises that Kendy had sent photos of to friends. Deputies and crime scene officers testified about what they observed. The dryer running mid-crime, the packed duffel bag, Dan's clean clothes and fresh deodorant, his demeanor, screaming, gagging, but absence of tears, and his awkward reactions during gunshot residue testing. These details were used by prosecutors as signs of staging, control, or deceit. Prosecutors assembled a mosaic of circumstantial evidence: the oddities of the crime scene, the bruises and trauma, the trajectory and blood anomalies, Dan's behavior and shifting stories, and Brooke's emotional testimony. They told jurors the defense would have you believe a perfect storm of coincidences, that Kendy suddenly decided to commit nude suicide in the bathtub, but the weight of the evidence shows a staged murder. They appealed to jurors' logic and conscience. Ask not whether they have proved exactly how every bruise was inflicted, but whether they have established beyond a reasonable doubt that Dan killed his wife and attempted to masquerade it as suicide. Johnson reminded jurors about lack of direct proof. No DNA on the gun, no definitive witness that Dan choked Kendy, no confession, and the possibility that evidence could have been altered by delays or environmental factors. He urged jurors to view inconsistencies skeptically. Ordinary people under extreme stress can misremember, and that without unequivocal proof, skepticism must favor the defendant. He framed the narrative as tragic: a woman torn between love and pain, a husband falsely accused, but not monstrously evil. He asked jurors, if you're left with questions, doubt, then you must acquit. After 10 days of testimony and 62 witnesses called to the stand, the jury retired to deliberate. They considered competing stories, weighed expert credibility, and debated the meaning of every bruise, blood pattern, and reaction. Approximately 8 hours later, they returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder and concurrent domestic battery. Brooke Wilkins, sitting in the gallery, burst into tears. Dan Howard's face remained impassive. No immediate reaction. The jury had concluded the state met its burden that Dan intentionally killed Kendy but did not convict on premeditated first degree. On May 23, 2024, nearly 2.5 years after Kendy Howard's lifeless body was found in the bathtub of her Spirit Lake, Idaho home, former Idaho State Trooper Dan Howard stood in court to hear his sentence. He wore the same expression that had haunted the courtroom since the verdict, calm, emotionless, almost procedural. Yet around him, the air was thick with grief, betrayal, and relief. Judge Rich Christensen of Kootenai County District Court presided over the sentencing. The room fell silent as Kendy's daughter, Brooke Wilkins, stepped forward to read her victim impact statement. Her words pierced the courtroom. "You taught me how to drive, Dan. You taught me how to trust people in uniform. And then you killed my mother." Tears rolled down the faces of jurors, reporters, and even seasoned deputies. Brooke described how her mother's laughter filled every room, how she would dance in the kitchen to 80s songs, how the world had gone silent since that February morning. She said she still hears the sound of Dan's voice on the 911 call, the performance of a lifetime, as she called it. When it was time for the judge to speak, his tone was deliberate, measured. He noted that while the jury convicted Dan of second-degree murder, the evidence left no reasonable doubt that Kendy's death was the product of control and violence. This was not a momentary lapse or a tragic misunderstanding, Judge Christensen said. This was a calculated act of domination over someone you vowed to protect. The court sentenced Daniel Howard to life in prison, with a minimum of 15 years before parole eligibility. He also received a concurrent 5-year sentence for the domestic battery charge tied to a 2020 incident involving bruising on Kendy's body. Dan showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read. No apology, no tears. Only when marshals led him from the courtroom did he glance back toward Brooke and Kendy's friend's expression blank, as if searching for a familiar uniform to hide behind. Outside the courthouse, Brooke and her aunt spoke with reporters. "We waited more than 2 years for this," Brooke said through tears. "No sentence will bring my mom back, but at least now the world knows the truth." Kendy's family described how the case had divided the small community. Some former colleagues of Dan initially refused to believe the accusations, defending his years of service as a trooper. Others, especially those who knew Kendy personally, had long suspected something was wrong inside the Howard household. In her final remarks, Brooke called for stronger protections for domestic violence victims who are married to law enforcement officers, arguing that Kendy's fear of retaliation and lack of faith in the system kept her trapped. "When your abuser wears the badge," she said, "who do you call for help?" In the months following his conviction, Dan's defense filed a notice of appeal, challenging the admissibility of certain forensic expert testimony and alleging inconsistencies in the pathologist's findings. He continues to maintain his innocence, insisting that Kendy took her own life and that he has been betrayed by the system he once served. While the appeal moves slowly through Idaho's appellate courts, few believe a reversal is likely. The evidence, both circumstantial and forensic, had been layered with enough complexity to sustain the jury's verdict. The Howard case sent shockwaves through Idaho law enforcement circles. Dan had been a respected member of the Idaho State Police for more than a decade, known for his professionalism and calm demeanor. To many officers, his conviction forced a reckoning. What happens when those trained to enforce the law use that knowledge to conceal a crime? Local agencies quietly reviewed their internal domestic violence policies. Advocates in Kootenai and Bonner counties reported an uptick in calls from spouses of law enforcement officers seeking counseling or protective orders. Kendy's story began to appear in domestic violence awareness campaigns across the Northwest, not as a statistic, but as a haunting reminder of the danger of silence. Today, the house on that quiet Spirit Lake Road stands empty. The walls have been repainted, the garden overgrown. Yet inside that bathroom, neighbors say, the sound never truly fades, the echo of the sirens, the cries, the whispered disbelief. For investigators like Detective Ken Lalatin, who first walked into the scene that night, the image remains indelible. The tub, the pale water, the absence of blood, and the knowledge that truth had been deliberately disguised. The hardest part, Lalatin later told 48 Hours, is knowing she probably trusted him until the very last moment. The case of Kendy Howard stands as one of Idaho's most chilling modern domestic homicide investigations, not only for its brutality, but for the subtlety of its deception. A 911 call meant to save a life instead became the key that unlocked a hidden world of abuse and control. And in the end, the bathtub that once seemed to hold a tragic mystery revealed everything Dan Howard tried so desperately to hide. In the end, it wasn't the blood on the walls or the gun in the tub that told investigators the truth. It was silence. The silence of a woman whose final moments were stolen by someone sworn to protect her. The silence of a small town that refused to believe one of their own could do something so dark. And the silence of a husband who thought he could script tragedy and call it suicide. But silence doesn't erase evidence. It only delays it. Kendy Howard's story reminds us that monsters don't always hide in shadows sometimes. They wear the badge of trust. This is Criminal Minds Archives, where every call, every clue, and every lie brings us closer to the truth. If stories like this remind you that truth always finds a voice, make sure you subscribe to Criminal Minds Archives and turn on notifications, because the next case file we open might be darker than you think.